Good morning. My name is Paul Pope. I am a senior fellow of the Intelligence Studies Project and a professor at the LBJ School after retiring from many years in the Army and CIA. I'm not as old as Trevorton, but I'm getting there. Sorry. I'm here to introduce your next panel. So students pursuing a Master of Public Affairs or a Master of Global Policy Studies at the LBJ School cap their academic experience with a project. It's called a Professional Research Project, or PRP. PRPs the intention is to connect a team of students with a client to address a complex real-world policy issue in the actual context of that issue. When I was asked to guide such effort, I thought about what kind of project I wanted to lead, and before I settled on that, I decided that I wanted to focus on governmental execution more than I wanted to focus on policymaking and policymaking process. And I particularly wanted to focus on achieving unity of effort across the government and how hard that is. My experience is that harnessing and getting everything you can out of one organization or leading change in a particular organization is hard enough. But trying to achieve unity of effort across the government is very difficult. And right now, all the national security challenges that we face require an integrated, multi-agency response. So we chose to look for our topic that you're going to hear about today at the interface between U.S. Special Operations Forces and the U.S. intelligence community after 9/11, how that changed, the direction it went in, and what we could learn in particular that would apply to current security challenges. This wasn't looking at intel integration alone or at intel community to DoD, but more narrowly at this particular topic area. Now, I'll just mention one thing in the context of the previous panel. The first objection we got to this was you can't possibly do that in an unclassified way. And we said, we bet can. And we haven't had any problem with it, really. There's a few things that we have to steer away from, but the kind of principles we're looking for can be talked about at an unclassified level. I'm going to let the students tell you more about the project. I want to mention a few things about our sponsors and the students themselves. So our sponsor for this project was the principal advisor and director for counterterrorism and national security on the National Security Council. He has now moved on, but the principal director for intelligence on the National Security Council took up the mantle of being our sponsor and has been very actively engaged and supportive, especially when we go into Washington. I want to express also our appreciation to the Intelligence Studies Project, which we're a part of and which funded our travel, but the Intelligence Studies Project receives its support from the Strauss and Clements Centers, and many of the people that support the Strauss and Clements Centers are in this audience. So thank you for the great trips we had to D.C., and the one we haven't taken yet for parts of this class, which have been so important to making the overall educational experience what we want it to be. I mean, the students got to, we exited the National Security Council on the West Wing steps. We've done some things that they're quite aware that this is not a normal academic process. We had a team of 14 students, and although many of them had no previous interaction with either special operations or intelligence, they brought a wealth of interesting experience to the project. We had students in the MPAF program and the GPS program. We had an MBA student from the Macomb School of Business. The group includes graduates from a variety of institutions, including University of Texas, Austin, several other schools in Texas, and as far afield as Boston College, and 2 West Point members of the team. 7 of the 14 members of this team were veterans or still serving on active duty. 2 who are not on active duty are applying for commissions. One is a naval officer and one is an Air Force officer. We have a serving first sergeant in a reserve unit. We have 2 veterans of the Peace Corps who served in Ethiopia and Micronesia. We have dual degree students in Arabic and Russian studies. We have a budding journalist who's had several articles on foreign crises published in newspapers this year. We have a guitar-picking West Texas troubadour. We have one of the leading female feral hog killers in Texas. She's female. I don't know if she discriminates on the hog side. We have a live music venue bartender who's also a qualified attack submarine torpedo man. So this is a diverse group that brings a lot of experience, a lot of insight. It's been my honor to lead them. I'm going to ask them to briefly introduce themselves, but if you'd please welcome Danny Leffler, Molly Adler, Cole Spitz, and Megan Bennett.
Hello, everyone. My name is Danny Leffler. I'm a global policy student at the University of Texas's LBJ School, where I focus on security law and diplomacy. As Professor Pope noted, this project examines integration and cooperation between the intelligence and special operations forces communities in the years leading up to and after the attacks of September 11, 2001. Attacks that triggered a mobilization across the U.S. national security apparatus, unlike anything witnessed really since the beginning of World War II. We chose to study this partnership because we believed that the results of our research would hold important truths for interagency cooperation on other key national security issues, particularly those found within the murky area between war and peace, often referred to as the gray zone. After beginning our work, we realized we actually had to redefine our definition of the problem. While we began by examining intelligence, special operations, integration as a goal, we soon realized that integration was actually just an enabler to what really mattered, which was overall performance. After making this adjustment, we pursued a deep examination of intel special ops performance in the realm of counterterrorism, an environment that, as we expected, proved to be rich in lessons that are relevant to the evolving threats of today and the future. This study involved a series of mutually reinforcing components, beginning with a far-reaching literature review, which helped us to cross-level knowledge and develop a common vocabulary among team members. Identifying relevant organizational theory helped us to make sense of and frame our findings as we went along. But most importantly, however, was a series of unclassified interviews with dozens of leaders, experts, and practitioners from across both communities. While we decided to postpone our more tailored interviews until later in the process, we did hold a series of toehold interviews early on in our work, which ended up shaping our project quite significantly writ large. In all, the interviews took place by phone, video conference, and in person, and in a variety of locations, from classrooms up at the LBJ School to the National Security Council and congressional offices in Washington, D.C. Together, these interviews helped provide a crucial window into some of the most critical breakthroughs in interagency and internal processes, joint operations, and also technology sharing and exploitation that occurred. We're extremely indebted to the sponsors that Professor Pope mentioned before, as well as to all the men and women who took the time to sit down with us and discuss their experiences and their knowledge and their wisdom. While it's not possible to mention all of them, to cite just a few, we had extended access to the most recent former directors of National Intelligence and CIA, 2 former deputy directors of DIA, and a host of highly experienced special operators. And we're very humbled by and appreciative of their taking part in this project. We'd also like to thank the Intelligence Studies Project, as well as the Strauss Centers and the Clements Center, for giving us this platform to present our work today. And we'd like to say thank you to you, the audience, for taking the time to listen. We're now going to move into a more nuanced discussion of the project itself, as well as of the broader contours of the gray zone, before sharing a few of our preliminary findings and recommendations. At the end of this, we'll be happy to take a few of your questions. And now I'm going to pass the floor to Molly Adler.
Hi, I'm Molly. I'm pursuing a master's in global policy studies as well as a master's in Russian, Eastern European, and Eurasian studies. And I try to focus on emerging technology and security. And I hope you'll all forgive me for referencing my notes quite heavily. I wouldn't want to miss anything in front of such an audience. So the conflicts of the early 21st century have forged more than cooperation between the U.S. intelligence community and the U.S. Special Operations Forces. In some areas, these conflicts have spawned new national security enterprises and sub-enterprises, such as the counterterrorism enterprise and the global manhunting sub-enterprise. Theory and experience suggest that organizations evolve over long periods of incremental change, similar to Darwin's theory of evolution. The normal state of evolution for biological species is characterized by stability and inertia. And this is the same for organizations. Long evolutionary periods of small change are punctuated by abrupt revolutionary change. So these 21st century conflicts, punctuated by the attacks on September 11th, have taken organizations beyond cooperation to integration, and in some cases, beyond integration to mutual dependence. And this is really what we focused a lot of our research on. Individually, post 9/11, each entity of the intelligence community and special operations learned to better perform its function in counterterrorism. The leaders of these manhunting enterprises clearly saw intelligence as a vital, critical line of operation. This ops-intel fusion manifested in other ways, one of the most significant being the degree to which operators saw intelligence gathering as an essential function of their job. Within that operational model, the once bright lines between intelligence gathering and operational targeting disappeared. However, it is also important and useful to distinguish between the different kinds of missions special operations were tasked with before generalizing. Specifically, we do not find integration to be as profound in the counterinsurgency arena or the foreign internal defense arena as in manhunting. For manhunting, this profound ops-intel fusion was the norm. And we believe this finding offers value in understanding lessons learned, and, if possible, how to apply these lessons to other national security problems. Manhunting questions are secrets, not mysteries. They are quite simply simple questions. Where is this guy? And 10-digit coordinates, if at all possible. The fact that these are simple questions in no way means that they are easy to answer. Some very smart people whose lives depend on it are working hard to deceive and confuse us as we attempt to answer them. The second reason that ops-intel integration reached a nirvana-like state in manhunting was necessity. In reading memoirs and interviewing on the subject, many of the key players, General McChrystal and Admiral McRaven, for example, were honest, humble, and straightforward in sharing this view. Intelligence wasn't just helpful or a combat multiplier, as it is sometimes described. It was an essential part. And this process is called F3EA: find, fix, finish, exploit, analyze, repeat as necessary. A really good example of this are the SEALs who executed the raid on bin Laden's compound in Abbottabad were able to seamlessly transition into a tightly compressed site exploitation mode while on the objective, because they've been doing this for years in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And according to a number of the experts we interviewed, this absolutely would not have been the case before 9/11 and reflects the degree to which F3EA has been learned, internalized, and standard practice. So these manhunting lessons can apply to other areas, but those areas must meet a limited criteria. Good examples are looking for mobile missiles in North Korea or cyber attribution. However, as my colleague Cole Spitzak will continue on and expand on, there are serious challenges with applying old tricks or old lessons to new dogs, such as the gray zone.
Okay. Well, I'm Cole Spitzak. I'm a second-year public affairs student here at UT. And I have a military background, and I'm going to talk to you about the gray zone. That's something I've studied and been passionate about the last 2 years. And please bear with me as I do also reference my notes so as not to exclude anything. So the gray zone officially entered the lexicon, at least as I could discern, in 2014 when General Votel, then the commander of SOCOM, mentioned it in congressional testimony on emerging threats to the United States. It's since been formally defined as aggressive competition in the space between war and peace. It's adversarial in nature, so it's more than peace, but it deliberately seeks to remain below the threshold of conventional war. It's characterized by ambiguity in the nature of the conflict, opacity of the parties involved, uncertainty of the legal frameworks that apply, and involves integrated campaigns across multiple domains employing mostly non-kinetic tools, and it's broadly incremental in nature. As a broad construct, the idea of the gray zone encompasses a host of non-conventional warfares, irregular warfare, information operations, political warfare, economic coercion, cyber warfare, and that's just to name a few. Gray zone is relevant as we focus on great power competition codified in the recent 2017 National Security Strategy and the 2018 National Defense Strategy. We see the gray zone as critical to understanding that renewed competition. Both China and Russia have studied the American way of conflict. They've been watching us, and they seek to avoid escalation to a conventional war, yet are actively subverting the United States, our allies, and the liberal international order for their purposes. Russia is the more aggressive, active threat, although China is indeed rising, is more patient, strategic, but increasingly assertive. Both are gradually eroding the U.S.-led world order and redrawing the world map in places like Georgia, Ukraine, and the South China Sea. Their gray zone activities are increasingly attracting global attention and eliciting blowback, but with a lack of concerted efforts to deter them, they will persist. As Americans, the rule of law is predominant in our cultural consciousness, so we tend to see conflict in this black or white war-peace dichotomy. Our enemies do not see the same. We're certainly not going to go to war over Russian actions in the Ukraine or Chinese militarizing the South China Sea, or cyber espionage, or even the recent election meddling. So the danger is, what will the world look like 10 years from now if we don't address the gray zone threats? I always like to think of, and I have 3 small children, so it's pictures are worth, or stories rather, but illustrations are worth a lot to them. The slow-boiled frog analogy always comes to mind here. So the idea that the frog put in the pot and the temperature slowly increased to the point that the frog, it never elicits a response that causes the frog to leave the pot until the frog is boiled. Excuse me, I struggled through that. My 3-year-old would appreciate it, though. So how do we escape the proverbial cauldron before it's too late and irreparable damage is done to our national interests, the world order, and even our democracy? In our quest to find lessons from the development of the formidable counterterrorism capabilities that we could apply to the gray zone, we found some important contextual differences between the environment in which those capabilities matured and the present circumstances we find ourselves in as we face the problem of the gray zone. The development of our synergistic counterterrorism capabilities came after 9/11, when we had national attention, overwhelming popular support, and virtually unlimited resources and a war mentality. It was a national priority for both the Bush and the Obama administrations and had the undivided attention, some would say, and I think Megan's going to mention the unblinking eye. I always think of Lord of the Rings and that Tower of Sauron, the unblinking eye of the National Security Council. It remains a top public concern even 16 years later, and it's resulted in the largest overhaul of the intelligence community since its inception in 1947. Not to be left out, special operations has been a growth industry itself. It's doubled in size and tripled in budget. But the circumstantial differences with the gray zone are noteworthy. Most importantly, there is no 9/11, the catalyst upon which all that support came for counterterrorism. Nor will there be. By nature, gray zone conflicts seek to avoid sparking a direct confrontation. So in developing our recommendations for the gray zone from our findings in the counterterrorism realm, we're mindful that the same environment of unprecedented support, attention, and resources is simply not there. Nor is the war mentality that was such a significant factor in forging the teamwork, mutual dependence, and focus that was needed. With that, I'll pass the floor to Megan, who will share with you our findings.
Hello, my name is Megan Bennett. I'm a dual degree student here at the LBJ School. I'm studying global policy studies and also a master's in Middle Eastern studies. I'm a veteran of the U.S. Army, where I served as an Arabic linguist in military intelligence, including 2 overseas tours. As my colleagues previously discussed, we've conducted research using the case study of integration and cooperation between the intelligence community and special operations forces for counterterrorism to assess if there are lessons that can be applied across the government for interagency organization for addressing threats in the gray zone. Now I'd like to give you an overview of our findings based on the evidence we acquired in our research and interviews, but I caution that our project is not complete and we are still in the process of developing both findings and recommendations. As noted by my colleagues, our national security enterprise became effective and efficient, some might even say exquisite, at manhunting operations. We found many reasons for this. One was an intense mission alignment across agencies and organizations, which overcame cultural and bureaucratic friction. Cooperation in this realm led to not only a deep respect for the unique capabilities and expertise that each organization brought to the mission, but a level of mutual dependence and a trust between agencies that we rarely see. As Molly noted, we wanted to be intentional about whether the context was simple, complicated, or complex before suggesting a transfer of lessons. Although we believe this kind of integration achieved in the counterterrorism fight is just what is needed for many of the problems in the gray zone, the way we must go about achieving unity of effort first depends on a deep understanding of the security challenge. This requires what General McChrystal called rich contextual understanding. If an integrated multi-agency response was required in answering obvious questions, like where is the terrorist, then rich understanding is even more essential in the complex spaces that define the gray zone. We do not think this understanding can be achieved without the perspective, capabilities, and contribution of multiple agencies. In planning and conducting operations, the emphasis on understanding creates a tension between reliance on prescriptive doctrine versus finding the appropriate course of action through deep understanding of the conflict. Again and again, we found that leadership was a critical ingredient in overcoming interagency tension or inertia. This includes both the ability to foster innovation through subordinates and what we call enterprise leadership. Virtually everything the government does requires the concerted effort of complex networks that are comprised of multiple actors and organizations. To succeed in this space, the U.S. requires senior leaders who possess not only extreme confidence in their own specialties, but the ability to work across organizational boundaries. Specifically, they must understand the institutional, organizational, and individual actors that comprise that mission space, be fluent with their cultures, view those actors as a single network, and build and leverage those networks to achieve the collective objectives of the national security enterprise. This enterprise style of leadership was a necessity for success, as exemplified by General McChrystal, Admiral McRaven, and Director of National Intelligence John Clapper during their tenures. As one specific example, in an interview, former Deputy Director of CIA for Science and Technology shared a number of examples of what he called abandoning ownership of innovations for the greater good. Not long after 9/11, CIA developed a battlefield capability to quickly exploit electronic media collected during counterterrorism raids. And then they sent trainers to turn that capability over to Joint Special Operations Command for its ownership. The 2 or 3 Pelican cases that were provided were rapidly cloned to standard issue. As a result, the intelligence community got priority material in a timely manner, which fed intelligence back into the cycle to direct Joint Special Operations Command counterterrorism operations. While we have said that it often takes a crisis to galvanize an appropriate interagency response and synergize government organization, as Cole mentioned, the gray zone, by nature, means our adversaries are trying to avoid sparking a crisis that would prompt a definitive response. We take some comfort, however, in our finding that the groundwork for interagency cooperation and sharing of technology in the counterterrorism arena that took place before 9/11 paid huge dividends after. While the dramatic flow of resources and an unblinking attention of the National Security Council may not be possible before a crisis, we judge that many actions we could take now would improve performance in the gray zone. For example, we do not believe we have developed a serious whole-of-government approach response on cyber. Some of the solutions would be unique to this problem, but in others, we believe we could directly apply lessons from the counterterrorism fight. The unity of effort and sense of shared mission that results from a crisis or occurs within the crucible of conflict or in a war zone is difficult to replicate back in the Beltway. The revelation that it is difficult to synergize without a crisis, but that leaders can operate with a war zone mentality is worth mentioning. To wrap up, we're not going to provide recommendations at this time, but we have invested considerable thought into their development. Our recommendations are going to range from the macro to the micro level, from the practical to the strategic. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Professor Pope.
Thank you. So we can take a few questions. We have some time to take questions, and we welcome them. Raise your hand, and we'll send a microphone to you.
Thanks very much, and excellent work. So I'd just like to ask whether or not you've challenged your own premise here a little bit, because there's no question that, or I would say there's no question that integration has created a more effective force, but what is the cost to that ancillary or secondary organization and their loss of capability in other arenas? And 2 weeks on from September 11th, I don't think that's a question that we're asking, but 17 years on from September 11th, what is the capability cost to some of those secondary organizations?
Cole, you've done some thinking on that. Could I ask you?
Sure. So, we did challenge that assumption a bit, and we actually got some good feedback from some of our interviews where we really reflected on how important diversity of thought remains, and that the concern as integration moves everyone to the same mold is you lose that. And so especially in an environment like the gray zone where you really need to think beyond what we're used to conceptually, you need that diversity of thought at the table. And so 17 years of us all kind of looking the same, thinking the same, developing the same mentality, there is that danger. How to address that, I don't know that we've quite cracked that nut. We like the idea of we commonly refer to it jargon-wise as hostage exchange, but really what we're talking about is joint duty, where as the interagency system is creating liaison relationships where folks spend time in different organizations and have that exposure that broadens them, but that doesn't necessarily assimilate them into that new culture or the one single culture that defines, SOF and IC. So I think the challenge there is to keep people rotating back to their original culture. You want that expertise. You want that culture that's unique to whatever they're coming from. But you want that exposure to everyone else.
I would just add to that in the class, in the course of the year, we have focused on this sort of special ops arena. But as we got into the gray zone, we were really struck by how many different challenges and how many. So there's if this was a study we were doing for the chief of staff of the Army, for example, and saying what kind of Army should you have, it's a tough question. It's a lot easier to have one primary threat that you're pursuing. Other questions, sir?
Thank you. Very nice presentation. My interest would be, as you think about the gray zone, what are the specific intelligence challenges it raises? You've referred to whole of government. That's very difficult for our government. You've also suggested the possibility of integration leading to too little creativity or groupthink. What are the other challenges in the intelligence realm that are thrown up by the gray zone?
Molly?
So something we talked about, not to get too into the theoretical, there's something called the Connally framework, and it's this idea of in manhunting, you have known unknowns. The simple questions, where is this guy? You know what the question is, you might not have an answer. In the gray zone, you approach more unknown unknowns. You need to have people who have to adapt and think critically to try and figure out what it is that we need to know and how do we act on that. And so one of the challenges that we approached is how do you take people who have been trained and are part of this exquisite known unknown finding enterprise into comfort with this unknown realm of who adversaries are, what do they want, is this an adversarial attack, or is this just someone clicked the wrong button somewhere?
I mean, an example that I talked about in class last week was we were talking about the Russian attempt to, their success in organizing a rival demonstrations in 2016 in Houston. And so the question I asked the students was the person in charge of that, or was the main energy that went into that the guy that was like a genius on bots and trolls, or bots and trolls kind of standard technology now, and that person had to be really smart in American society and its cleavages and what was going on in the United States. So countering something like that is going to require an integration of not only agencies, but disciplines. You're going to have to bring the technology with the... So these are the kind of things we've been grappling with. And as Cole said, we haven't got any glib answers for you. Other questions? Sir, right here.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you concluded with regard to how our adversaries think about gray zone and what techniques they use to give that meaning in conflict with us. Because it seems to me this is one way that they are using power asymmetrically. In other words, they can't deal with us head-on, force to force. Right. So they've got to go gray. What are the range of techniques that you see them using when you think of something like Russian policy in Ukraine or Crimea or the Baltic area or wherever? What are we up against?
Well, that's great. Cole to take that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And, the gray zone, first of all, you're right in characterizing the fact that they really have to go there. We are still the dominant player. We have overwhelming conventional dominance. And really, quite frankly, nuclear war still precludes, and the risk of escalation precludes any kind of conventional force-on-force conflict between these great powers anyways. But along with that is a difference in strategic culture. I think the U.S. military has come a long way. But again, we like that Desert Storm model. We like that quick, fast, we're in, we're out, we have a righteous cause, and it's clean. When we tried it the second time around, it didn't quite go the same way, and that's a different discussion. But again, the Chinese, the Russians, they've been watching that. They see that they need to come at us a different way, and so that manifests itself with the nexus of the information age, this ability to use, whether it's bots and trolls. They're really trying to sow chaos. That's at least for the Russians. The Chinese are a little bit more deliberate. They have that long view in mind. And so they can really, and that's really part of their strategic culture in a sense. That's different than the American culture. And so that goes back to that rich contextual understanding of knowing our enemy, or I wouldn't say enemy, but our adversaries, and seeing how they're approaching the problem. They see this spectrum of conflict. They don't see this black and white dichotomy that we tend to. And so whether that's exploiting the new and evolving tools of cyber, which are relatively low cost to get into. This isn't I need to have a 10-year plan for the next 5th generation fighter. I don't need to have $5 billion for an aircraft carrier. For relatively low cost and manpower and resources, I can create a few troll farms and I can disrupt the democracy of the United States of America.
Cole, could I jump in and ask you to in responding to John's question for the rest of the audience, we don't have time to go through all the things they do in the gray zone, but tell us what little green men are.
So little green men, this is really popularized after the Crimean episode. So Russia, of course, first of all, one thing people don't understand is that Crimea was not just a flashpoint. Although Russia and President Putin are certainly very opportunistic, and they reinforce success, there was a prelude to that. So the Russians, for a long time, have seen Crimea as something they would like to reacquire, and that they thought was unrightfully given to Ukraine. And so there were things, whether that's agents that are put in place to foster anti-Ukrainian and coalesce pro-Western views in Crimea, whether that's to isolate the population. They're doing all these things in advance, and then they come in with little green men, which, of course, ends up being actual military arms of the Russian forces, just not wearing any name tags or insignia. to occupy the country, in a sense, by force. But under that thin guise of self-determination and a popular referendum and all these things that give them just enough credibility and sow enough confusion and the ambiguity of who are these little green men that the rest of the international community can't effectively respond.
Great, thank you. One more. How about this gentleman right here?
Thank you. Bill Hartman. Just following up on that other question, would you talk about the role that outsourcing plays in the gray zone particularly?
Who wants to take that? Okay, Molly.
So as the previous panel talked about, within the gray zone on the U.S. kind of unity of effort, there is having outside companies help with cyber attribution. And so you're seeing, because it's happening in the gray zone, a lot of people are coming in to fill niches that maybe we don't necessarily want them in, or maybe necessarily we didn't expect them to be there in the first place. As far as gray zone actors in adversarial nations or non-state actors, you see them coming into the gray zone approaching from how can I achieve my objective as low cost as possible. And that's why the gray zone kind of creates this opportunity for people who necessarily wouldn't be on the radar of U.S. national security enterprises at the same level. And as was previously discussed in another talk, there's this idea of we would like to get to a place where these things can maybe be solved at a regional or local level. There should be stopgaps in place to kind of stop gray zone threats before they get to the level of election meddling or
on the
levels.
Outsourcing thing, is there a particular example you can think of them using a proxy or? We saw many. I'm just trying to think of which one.
There's a lot of, I would say, like false proxies. The idea of we think that they are in fact proxies, but they are directly linked in some capacity to foreign governments.
They can almost create them and throw them away. The event I mentioned a few minutes ago, they created an organization called the Heart of Texas. The Heart of Texas had 250,000 people following it, and it was completely artificial proxy. It basically, by the way, when they encourage people to go to this demonstration against Muslims and encourage Muslim organizations to come back, they also said that, hey, we expect the other side to bring guns, so you probably should bring your guns. So this is in trying to incite violence in the state of Texas. They created the proxy in that case. Right,
and so social media and these open platforms can, in fact, serve as mediums through which proxies can easily create and shed identities. And so you like something on Facebook that's Americans for True American Freedom can be completely created through adversarial nations just trying to incite violence or contention between U.S. citizens.
That's going to conclude our time for questions. I wanted to finish a little bit early because I am now to give you an administrative announcement. I'm going to get you to applaud my students in a minute, but I wanted to get this out first because I don't like to stand between people and lunch. But what we're going to do is we're going to move through these doors back here, make a left, and then go over here, and there will be a room with 4 lines for your sandwiches and lunch. And we're going to ask you to move smartly back in here because our speakers will not enter based on their security details, instructions, until everyone is seated. If you can take a seat, if you need to go back and get something to drink, you can do that later after they move in. And we would like that to happen no later than sitting in your seat, 12:25. So I think you can see why I like my job. Could you give these folks a hand?